Hello everybody, how you doing? And welcome to another tutorial. This time I'm actually painting a snow scene, which will be one of my first snow scene tutorials. I went out on Friday and I had no success actually out and about. I couldn't find anywhere to paint, so I came back to my studio and set up this tutorial to paint this scene. This particular painting is inspired by a trip I took up to Fraser Park last year, I think, maybe the year before, end of 2018, early 2019, when they'd had a dump of snow. I'd been up there a little earlier in the week and there'd been a little bit of snow, so I went up with my family. And then I went back up with a camera to take some photographs, and this particular cabin was part of a derelict group of cabins just off the road, maybe 100 yards or so off the road. But I couldn't find anywhere to park nearby, so I had to drive almost quarter of a mile away and hike down the side of a banking to get to this particular scene. It was interesting because not only did nobody know I was there, so I got a little bit nervous, but there were a lot of bear prints in the snow. So even though it was frightfully quiet where I was taking these photographs, I was a little bit nervous. I wanted to get out of there pretty quick. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial. I'm going to do a voiceover now and explain all my choices for making this painting, why I chose this particular composition, the palette that I used, and why I chose to do an extra day to finish it. So thank you very much for subscribing to my channel and my membership on my website. I'm very grateful for your support, and I hope you're enjoying these tutorials. So as usual, I'm laying down the coloured light, the toned ground on the canvas board. I pre-gessoed this board with some oil-based gesso, and I did it maybe 3 or 4 times, so the canvas weave is set back quite a bit. It's almost, it was almost pasted on. So it had a fairly glossy surface. It's not ideal. This is just something I was experimenting with a while back when I was gessoing my own canvases. But I found this, I believe it's a 12 by 16 inch. Oh, tell a lie, it's 11 inch by 14 inch canvas board, which I put oil-based gesso on there. Looking at my reference photo, I did feel like it was quite a warm, even though it was a crisp, cold day, the light in this particular valley was warm. Had a lot of orange tones, especially on the tops of the trees. I also wanted to bring out a lot of the hues in the snow, so the snow has really cool patches and warm patches. So the ground, this brown red earth ground, pretty much straight out of the tube, is a transparent earth red by Gamlin, which I sell over at my store. And then I've wiped that off. Used a little bit of OMS, mineral spirit, so that it was fairly dry. Well, I mean, you can see I'm able to wipe on into it or wipe it away, but by the time I start laying in my colours, it's tacky and it's fairly dry. I split the board, separated the board out into thirds so that I can transfer my reference image over onto the canvas. So the focus of this painting is obviously going to be the derelict cabin. And I've selected this particular composition because the cabin is right there in the focal point where those two lines intersect each other down in the bottom right third of the canvas. I've opted for a fairly low horizon as well, with pretty much the actual snow horizon going along that lower third as well. You've got the mountain that I've just kind of roughly sketched in there. coming across the canvas at the diagonal from top right. And you're only going to see it like a selection of that through the trees, but I wanted to put it in there so I had some reference. Snow is always an interesting thing to paint because it kind of goes against a little bit of, against the principles of the values which I learned from reading Edgar Payne's work and Carlson, specifically Carlson when he talks about the four planes, the sky being the lightest, and then the plane that's perpendicular to the sky, which is usually the ground being the second lightest, and then anything that's at an angle on the landscape, for instance mountains in the distance, would be the third lightest, kind of a medium tone, and then the darkest tones are usually verticals. But the exceptions are painting snow scenes and often painting sand, I find. In this particular occasion, the lightest part of the picture is not going to be the sky, it's going to be the foreground, the snow. So it kind of turns the composition a little bit on its head. But what I liked about this particular selected reference image was the dark mass of the trees, in contrast to the foreground snow, the big light mass there in the foreground. And my goal with this painting really was not to overwork the trees. I wanted them to be set back almost in focus. And there wasn't, again, because of the time of day, although there were some shadows on the snow, there wasn't particularly a harsh light on the trees. So it was very important setting out on this painting to make sure that the value between the lights and the darks in the tree was a fairly short gamut. So I didn't have bright highlights, dark shadows. They all kept in this kind of consolidated area of green. I wanted the trees, obviously, because there were so many of them stacked one in front of the other. I wanted them to feel, natural, and almost blend them all together. I opted to do a value sketch in a burnt umber on top of that warm earth ground. I quite enjoyed this stage, making sure that my values were correct. The reference image I was working from on my computer monitor. I was able to pull the saturation out of the image so that I was working from a monotone image, just in black and white, which gave me a much clearer sense of what those values were going to be, and it helped me in these early stages. I think while I was making this painting as well, it was very important, always in the forefront of my mind, even though the reference image hadn't captured any of the colors in the white of the snow. I really wanted to make the snow area interesting because I've seen so many other painters and paintings of snow scenes, and they had these beautiful purple shadows on the snow, and then in the highlighted area ever so subtle warm oranges mixed in with white around the edges. So this painting, the focus was always going to be on cool and warm tones in the local colors. So cool and warm tones in the trees rather than high contrast values in the trees, and the same in the snow. Going back to gesso in my canvases, I've been searching for the perfect surface that I really enjoy working on. So I often experiment with different gessos, acrylic base, oil base, different linen, different weave. For the longest time, I've really enjoyed just working straight onto the gesso boards by Richardson. And I was working on toned gesso boards for a while because I really, especially outdoors, because I really liked the fact that I had that neutral ground, either a grey or a warmer sort of amber toned board. But it took away from my ability to actually tone the ground myself based on what I saw as the predominant color of the light. So I went back to working off of white Richardson gesso boards when I'm outdoors for the most part. I like the smooth surface, but I was always on the hunt for a really nice linen or canvas. And I finally found some. Again, I purchased 2 large rolls of this oil-based oil gessoed, double oil gessoed linen from Japan. And I love it. So I've made my own boards now. The tooth is kind of quite fine. And I work predominantly on this linen, which I glue to the boards myself and cut those boards on my saw in the garage. Hopefully I'll get to the stage where I can sell those as Richard Oliver surfaces maybe one day. It's my ultimate goal. But just going back to this particular canvas, I'd used the oil-based gesso, which takes weeks to dry, and I put it on in various. I had a couple of panels which were just 1 layer. A couple of panels I did 2 layers. A couple of panels I did 4 layers, and this ended up just being a little bit too glossy for my liking. So the paint kind of wipes off. It doesn't really stay. It doesn't, with the Richardson boards, they tend to be slightly absorbent, whereas on this particular board, the gesso wasn't absorbent at all, and I'd also put too much on, so there wasn't much of a tooth. So I got to the stage where I wasn't able to work into the painting anymore because I kept lifting off the paint. So I made this painting in 2 sittings. So while I was talking, then you noticed that I've pretty much finished the value study in that burnt umber, wiped away some of the areas so that not too much of that ground leaked into my whites, which I knew I was going to put down. Now here's one of the interesting things about painting snow scenes, especially when I went up and took my reference photos, is a lot of the contrast in the painting is based on how bright that snow area is, and since the snow is obviously white is going to be my brightest value in relation to the snow. The sky was quite dark, and I find that quite often when I photograph in snow scenes, maybe because the altitude's pretty high and the sky is very clear and fresh, the sky tends to be a really rich blue. But also with the painting of snow, the contrast is heightened because of the whiteness of the snow itself. So everything else, in order to get a good value study, everything else in the painting must be a lot darker. So it's almost as though it's the opposite of painting a sky dominant picture, which the sky is generally the lightest object, and in relation to the sky, the land then is going to be much darker. Always has to be darker than the sky. If you're painting that sort of sky dominant painting, in this particular case, in order for my whites to be realistic on the canvas, my white pigment realistic on the canvas, everything else has to go down quite a few notches in value, and that's the sky as well. I still try to get that transition between the sky as it gets close to the horizon and then the more ultramarine hue the further up you go through the arc of the sky. And my goal with the trees here was to paint the shaded areas almost as though they were like silhouettes in a blue. I've seen this done by some paintings that I really love. Put in the dark silhouette of the tree against the sky and making it that sort of purple blue haze, and then building up greens on top of that. So as you can see, I'm working those trees almost as silhouettes at first, with a muted darker value of blue. It was important as well for me to make sure that I retained the trunk of the pine tree, and that all of the branches coming off of that trunk were realistic. So I focused on making sure that at the early stage, while I was doing the value study, that I painted those trunks in and staggered them so that they felt natural. And I wanted to make sure that, I was adhering to the natural structure of the tree, of the pine tree itself. I thought it was important to get those whites in early so that I had something to reference in terms of my value. So after I did those silhouettes of the tree up the top, I just went ahead and tried to get my whitest whites onto the canvas, and then I knew that I could work down from that. And as you can see here, I'm adding just some shaded areas in the blue, trying to keep the value natural and realistic. Using the white, quite opaque, thick, and pasting it on. But I did add a little bit of yellow to the light, especially in that exposed areas. And I'm working with a little bit of cerulean and alizarin red mixed into that white for these shadows. And already I felt pretty good about how the painting was working out this stage, adding those shadows and having a little bit of colour in the white so it wasn't just stark and dead. With the high contrast with the brightest values on there now, I was able to get a better idea of the dark shadows in the trees, and also the value of the lighter areas in the trees as well. As I mentioned earlier, just trying to keep everything quite loose, quite expressive. You let the brush do most of the work. Let in some of that brown burnt umber value study just stay as part of the painting, So just add in little bits of cool shadows right now, making my shadows from the phthalo blue with a little hint of Hansa yellow, which is a cooler yellow, to maintain the cool shadows in the dark areas of the trees. But because most of these trees were lit as well, the ones that were to the left-hand side, the shadow areas was going to be a little bit warmer actually, so more red, or instead of adding red, I was just letting the brown, the warmth of the burnt umber do a lot of the work for me, but just letting that show through. Putting my highlights on top of my shadows helps me model a more realistic tree, I feel, because it's the same as, the light is always on the surface, on the outside edge, facing the light source. And by putting my lights over my darks like this, it's a little bit more difficult to do because, obviously you've got to use more opaque, lighter colors, but it actually gives a more realistic modeling because you're almost painting the light rather than painting the trees themselves. You're painting that highlighted area in color. So I'm using very thin, for the most part, very thin, lean paint. But because of that gesso I was talking about earlier, I'm having to almost paste it on with the flat side of the brush because these filberts were lifting quite a bit of the existing paint off of the canvas. So I'm holding the brush at its end and using like the flat edge and modeling these trees, different angles of the brush, letting the brush do a lot of the work, following the branches and just staying true to that trunk that's still fairly visible up the middle of all of those trees. It was at this stage when I pretty much knew that I'd have to do a couple of sit-ins on this painting, let it dry for a day or so at least it was touch dry. And as complicated as it seems, I mean, there's not a lot of colour in a painting like this. You've got a lot of trees, but if you maintain that value between the lights and the darks in the tree, then all I've got is my blues, my whites, and my greens for the most part in this painting. The cabin itself was a worn, reddish, sienna kind of tone. Again, an earth red, so that's what I liked about the reference image, is bringing that red in to as a complementary to the greens, the big massive green there. What wasn't in the painting that I started to, change and adopt was the light grey value of the atmospheric perspective as that diagonal tree line in the background emerges between the trees. I quite liked that. That wasn't there, but I liked the fact that it was lighter and it was more, it was more pale and more purplish. So in my second pass, I made more, tried to make a little bit more of a feature of that, like by adding it and not staying completely true to the reference image. Using a little bit of a finer, softer bristle brush here with these lines. Adding a little bit of the highlight to the barn and solidifying some of those lines, making them a little bit sharper. So this is day 2. The painting has dried a little. And what I did notice is I didn't quite like how messy the sky was, especially as it was transitioning into the foliage of the trees. Some of the colours had blended. I'd got too much green in the blues and too much blue in the greens, so it didn't feel right. So I wanted to just work on getting the nice light transition of that horizon just above the diagonal hill, blending up into the more ultramarine of the top part of the sky. It also makes a little bit of a feature of those trees, makes them seem a little bit more silhouetted, especially the one there on the left hand side, which is set back from the main tree on the left third. And this is where, again, I wanted to make a little bit more of a feature of the atmospheric perspective over that hill in the background there. So I've made that a little bit more bluish purple. And a few more sky holes, but making sure that they stay dark so that they don't stand out too much. Feel a lot better now that the sky has got more natural kind of light to dark gradation going from the horizon up to the top, and just start to work in some of those, correct some of the details in the shadows there, make some of those highlights pop a little bit more. Again, just the first pass with my white, I wasn't able to get the stark bright whites that I saw in my reference image, so it definitely needed a second coat. And again, I wanted to just make the paint a little bit more interesting by heightening the saturation of the blues in the shadows. A little bit of an artistic license to make the painting itself just feel more interesting. Now the white in the foreground is probably touch dry, so I'm going to be able to do like fairly thin glazes of color over that to make the warm whites appear more warm and in keeping with that light that I saw in the reference image. Really want to bring out the really nice value. Pasting on thick impasto whites to aid with this molding. And the impasto, I use liquid impasto by Winsor & Newton with the white to give it really nice big thick brush marks, and I can use those marks then to sculpt and give this feeling that the blanket of snow is on top of all of those elements in the painting. I like to use the angles of my brush marks and really try and get a good feel for the elements that I'm painting. And with it being snow, not being shy to use big, thick, broad impasto brush strokes. Now, one of the nicest parts that I still feel about this painting is there's a blue shadow that I bumped up the saturation in front of the house, in that little patch of grass in front of the house. I add a little bit of a purplish blue, I mix some cerulean with some white, and I add that shadow, and it really makes the painting pop. It's my favorite aspect of the painting. I'm going to blend these shadows in the foreground, make sure that it feels, the clear, high altitude, crisp light that was on the scene, but not overly crisp where the shadows are unrealistic. I felt as though, the darker parts of the trees had got a little bit lost. And I had also, noticed that the value underpainting, because it was just a burnt umber, those trunks weren't as dark as I would have liked them to be. So I wanted to make a little bit more of a feature by bringing out some of those trunks again in some of those areas. Not overdoing it, because I have to remember that the foliage on the outside is always going to cut across those trunks. So make sure that you're just being selective about where you're going to place those main trunks and any sort of hints of branches coming off of those trunks. But I'm also mindful at this point that I'm still going to be bringing up some of those highlights and painting in some of the foliage again. So that's going to cut those trunks a little bit more. But I really do like the verticals, stopping that diagonal movement of the eye down the painting, just putting little breaks on that, especially that area on the left hand side. It's almost as if those two trees, one on the right and one on the left, are stopping the eye from just flowing off of the canvas. The shadows coming from the left up to the front of the house lead the eye to that area and to those windows and open doorways where you can actually see through the building. And if you're wondering what that metal pole that I'm using, that's a mahl stick. I've got a little telescopic, well, it's not telescopic, it's in 3 pieces which I can screw together. And I can use to rest my hand on when I'm painting more detailed areas, just like I'm doing right now. Filling out some of the shadows, darkening some of the shadows. You can't really see it in this video at this point, but I'm using quite a cool black, which I've mixed using I can't say it, I can never say it. Alizarin, and my ultramarine with a little bit of phthalo blue, making it a kind of very cool purple, dark purple. Once I did that, I stepped back a little bit and I was thinking, well, that's maybe too much. So I just let that dry a little bit, and then I added some more color in those cool areas, in the shaded areas, I should say, on the building. So I want to add some more warm hues to the lit areas and tidying up some of those lines. But I also add some cool areas to the edges of the building there. So at this point I feel like I maybe overdid it just a little bit with some of my contrast in the building. So I start to darken some of the lit areas and lighten some of the dark areas. It's all about refining and, viewing the painting as it in relation to all the other elements. Sometimes you can get in too close with the details, and all I was looking at was the building, and I wasn't looking at how it was working in relation to the trees and the sky and the snow. So, you change it up a little bit and you go somewhere else in the paint and you start working on other areas. So I've added a tiny little bit of cadmium yellow to my white to give it a bit of a warm glow. And again, I'm pasting on that white in the foreground there, leaving some of the kind of purplish orange that was from my first pass. Just softening some of the edges. I think it was a bit too sharp. And I'm pulling just a little bit of white into some of those shadows. And I'm using that fan brush. If you've seen any of my other tutorials, I had an old fan brush which I decided just to chop up. I took a knife to it. And it gives it a really serrated edge, which is perfect for blending and also for doing more random, realistic kind of grasses and foliage. So right now I'm just stepping back from the work and I'm looking at the bits that are standing out too much, working on some of those transitions, trying to get the painting to feel a little bit more harmonious. I managed to adjust the contrast in the video just a little bit because I did feel like it was too dark. And at this point, I think I felt as though, again, the light of the trees, the light behind the trees was too bright. So I'm knocking that back a little bit more with a slightly more grayed out uniform blue, making the transition seem a little less extreme, so softening that transition. And also, again, as I mentioned earlier, making a more of a feature of the horizon, or the false horizon of the hillside, that diagonal hill. I wanted to feel like we were looking between the trees. My reference image, it went from a light blue to a very dark blue, and I didn't feel like it worked as a painting. So my goal with these, the goal with these blues is just trying to make a much more natural transition. And make a more interesting painting, Right now I'm serving the painting, so I'm going away from what is from adhering 100% to the reference image, and I'm trying to look at the painting and be like, well, what does the painting need? What's working? What's not working? I felt as though the sky was a little bit too, dare I say, a little bit too rich. So I wanted to knock back, using a lot more grey. And again, the video doesn't show it too much, but I've used a lot more grey in the sky because I felt like it was too heavy. Having a day to sit back and taking the painting, I took photographs of the painting on my phone and I looked at it in relation to, in a smaller format, and I also looked at it as a black and white image to see whether or not it was all working. And right now, it's like I said, it's touch dry, so I'm able to go over the top of those darker areas with my highlights, my green highlights. And I really don't want to risk going too bright, but I definitely needed to knock back some of those trunks a little bit, and I wanted to bring some warmth to the trees. So especially that tree in the foreground. And now you can see how, by bringing those branches over the front of the tree, it makes it much more realistic. Still leaving some of the underpainting to come through, but I really think that this passed by adding those highlights on the greens, especially the little fine details, with a softer brush on the edge and little bits of snow on the branches of those trees. Brought the actual background to life a lot more. Just fine tuning some of the foliage, adding a little bit of mark making to suggest little bits of brush and grassy areas just popping up through the snow. This is where I decide to, as you can see, really emphasize that atmospheric perspective. Chopping the horizon, I thought it was just a little bit too sharp, so I wanted to soften that, and I'm adding a little bit of artistic license by continuing that that hillside back behind the trees there on the left, I felt like that was maybe a bit heavy, so quite like that purple. I did feel at this point that the contrast on the building was again too much. Right now I'm doing like little glazes, and you can maybe see here in the video that I'm really adding a cool purple wash to that shadow area. It's just added life to the shadow on that side of the building. It felt a little bit bland. Felt like I lost a little bit of the value in the hue in the shadows of that tree on the right hand side, right corner. So again, just bringing out those. Oh, that's that blue I was telling you about earlier. I think that just makes it pop. Love the lighter shadow. And the reason why that's going to be lighter, obviously, going back to the principle that because it's on the side of a hump, it's now reflecting the sky a lot more, the blue from the sky. So instead of it being, flat and almost compressed, it's facing more towards me, and the reflection of that blue sky is really made that into a feature. Draws your eye to the center of the painting there by the front edge of that the building. Again, so I'm using a glaze, using a very thin layer of probably liquid, just to add bits of saturation and color to those areas. Now that I'm overworking this, I know I'm putting this on too thick. I wanted to knock it back a little bit, but this is all an attempt to reduce the high contrast that I had got the day before. So again, making the shadows slightly lighter, making the dark area a little bit dark, and as you can see, just glazing on little bits of color and then just wiping that into the impasto of the snow, the dried area. And I do have to apologize, this is actually day 2. So until I started working the sky, we were still on the first day, and now this is day 2. So painting's practically dry, and I'm just able to go over the dry impasto because I was using that impasto liquid, those whites which would normally take forever to dry were fairly dry, and I was able to do glazing over the top. A little bit more of a snowy element to that. Sharpen that edge at the top. Because I put a fine glaze layer on the snow in the foreground, if I just use a regular white, it's going to pick up some of those warm tones. Not too much to affect it, but it's going to give it a tint. I do that quite often. Before I start painting opaque, I'll often just do like a color glaze, which I like the more opaque paint to pick up, and it kind of harmonizes and consolidates it. So getting close to finishing this piece now. I just wanted to use that chopped up brush again to give some more realistic foliage, softening some of the edges of the trees. They looked a little bit harsh up against the sky, so just being expressive with those chopped up bristles. I felt as though I was losing a little bit of that tree, so I took a risk and used slightly lighter green to bring it forward. I feel like it works. It's almost, allows me to warm up the tones in that tree and tie it in a little bit more with the warmth of the woodwork. the cabin. And just a matter of refining, just constantly working in refining. And there's my final piece. You know, it's got some of the kept some of the feel of the drawing. You know, the video doesn't always show it exactly. In its true tones, but hopefully you can see from this particular photograph, you know, the tones that I managed to get and how it feels a lot more harmonious in the image. So I hope you again got some benefit from this particular tutorial. Please do not hesitate to add comments to the tutorial. I always go through them and try and incorporate whatever you comment into my new next tutorial. My goal here is really just to share all the methods and techniques that I've developed over the years with you, and trying to give clear reasons why I make the decisions I make. But I thank you so much for continuing to support my career, my family, and I'm extremely grateful for your subscription. Until next time, thank you so much.